Good morning, everyone. I'm Deepal Panchal. I'm a Preclinical Program Director at the Global Center of Medical Innovation. Welcome. Joining me today are Jason Claiborne. He's a Preclinical Operations Director with Boston Scientific. We have Tyler Wanke. He's the co-founder and CSO of Innovative Designs. And Dr. Jeff White, he's CFO and COO of the Global Center of Medical Innovation. We are here today to discuss common and commonly hidden costs in preclinical work and what to watch out for when life science innovators are evaluating preclinical partners and estimates. We'll be watching out for questions. If we don't get to yours, feel free to connect with us at the summit or email us. So to lay a little bit of a foundation about this session, preclinical studies for new medical devices can be very expensive, and in fact, even more expensive when you have to repeat them. Life science innovators need to be well informed about common and really the hidden costs in preclinical study estimates. Get it right the first time and with proper planning and understanding of critical items. Especially those that might be hard to find or are omitted when you get estimates from CROs. All preclinical study estimates are not created equal. They don't always include line items that can widely influence the total fee. And more goes into a preclinical study that is critical, but not always obvious, and you may not see it on the estimate. So what costs should you expect and what should you watch out for when you're planning your preclinical study, meaning your animal study or benchtop studies before you're submitting your device for FDA approvals and clearances? What's needed, what's frequently missing in preclinical estimates, and let's get it right for the first time and find the best chance for your preclinical work. So I'll start with Jeff. Let's start with baselining. What do you think are the service costs that should appear in a comprehensive preclinical program proposal or estimate?
Sure, thanks to Paul. Good morning, everyone. Well, first, contract research organizations or CROs create estimates differently, so make sure you review the competitive bids with that in mind. In general, CROs take the scope of work and interpret what's needed to create a project plan, including an estimate. The sponsor's unique scope of work will often drive the actual elements of an estimate. Although there's no typical study, the most common costs we see in the estimates we put together include things like protocol writing. So this would be your IACUC or your GLP document. And these both serve as the blueprint to ensure that the study is compliant and that you generate the data you need to support your project. Another area would be model acquisition, and most high-quality CROs will purchase animals from USDA-approved Class A vendors, which means that they're purpose-bred for research. In addition to the animal, model acquisition costs may include things like transportation, vaccinations, and quarantine, so look for those in that group. Procedural costs are by far the most expensive portion of estimates, and this is largely driven by the number of time points, the relative complexity of the procedure, and the different types of equipment needed. In addition, you might see estimated costs for things like follow-up exams, relooks, definitely a section on supplies, reporting, especially if you're doing GLP work, and then third-party vendors. And so this would be things like pathologists, clinical pathology, offsite imaging, or anything else that you need testing for. And then finally, you might see a section for GLP fees. For safety studies intended to be submitted to FDA under 21 CFR Part 58, you'll typically see this line item to cover additional administrative and quality costs associated with these types of studies. I'd say that that's a pretty good list of the typical costs that you'll see in most estimates.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So Jason, thinking about these line items, do you look at these services as commodities where all CROs should just price them the exact same regardless of where they're located, whether in the US or Europe or Canada?
So yeah, good question. And we absolutely don't see them as commodities. I think from our perspective, we would like it to be, because it would make it a lot easier, and you know, doing apples to apples comparison would be a lot easier than what we see right now on the market. we've started to look at ways to try to baseline and to try to make sure your comparisons are similar across CROs, so that you know what you're getting up front, and you don't have those hidden costs that I'm sure we'll talk more about. And one of the things we started to look at is, a per animal cost, but then also making sure that that's an all-in per animal cost, and it allows you to do that type of comparison.
Okay. So when you're looking at these costs again, are you assuming that all CROs deliver or should be delivering the same exact level of quality for the products or services?
I don't think that's a fair assumption.
Okay.
I think we see a lot of variability across the industry, both domestically and abroad.
Okay.
And it's something that definitely needs to be investigated on the front end, through vendor qualifications, through, in-depth and thorough reviews of the quotes, and then, time with a CRO. You generally want to start with small lead-in studies that don't have a big cost commitment, and allow you to kind of get that relationship built with the CRO, understand how they do business, because it is quite variable across the market.
Okay, thanks. So Tyler, you've done a fair share of your preclinical studies at Inablative. Are there other things besides the obvious cost on the estimate that drives the placement of the preclinical study at a CRO? What takes precedence? Is it in making this decision? Is it time? Is it cost? Is it a combination of everything?
That's a good question, Dee. It really depends on situation by situation. I mean, we've done a lot of studies within Ablative. We've done them at different CROs across the country, and at different points in time, different things mattered. At some points in time, first of all, to start, and to your earlier question, it's much more than just a commodity, pricing where you say we want to do X number of animals and this is kind of what we want to do and that's it. I mean, usually when we'll look, we'll get down to the details about exactly what kind of, care the animals are getting, what kind of, a lot of the specifics about what you're getting, and we'll try to make it apples to apples. But even then, like you said, it's never apples to apples because, I think you mentioned something about geography. Well, you might be paying more for a lab that's right, in maybe near downtown Atlanta than another location, maybe not. But you also might have benefits there, which I'm sure we'll get into later. Like, for example, being in a big metropolitan area where you have access to lots of users. So that's one part of it. But really, the big picture thing I wanted to say is, you really have to look at the big picture cost at hand and what matters to us at different points in time. We're being an early stage startup. Speed was key, and we'll always look at, I'm sure at bigger companies too, like Jason's seen. If you have certain projects, you might be looking at what's your overall time and cost, but what's your overall time to get this done? And in our case, sometimes our whole company's progress is relying on getting an animal study done in time. It can become the critical path toward the whole company moving forward with milestones, like, for example, getting that critical FDA clearance for which, this animal study, is the main thing that you might need to get that. So what's my point? I think it depends on the situation, but sometimes you might really be looking at which lab can get it done in time. Sometimes labs will be more expensive, but they might offer expediting, and they might have a big, hardy staff that can handle getting your study done maybe, quicker and have more bandwidth than another lab. And sometimes that kind of, stuff comes into play. And then one last thing I'll mention high level, and then I'll stop, but I can come back to it later if you want, is you also have to look at, really at the end of the day, what do you need to get done to be, successful at your company or this project? And I know for us, we've taken the route where we've gone sort of the fast, dirty, maybe cheaper route before with some CROs, only to find out that we didn't get the quality we wanted. We ended up not doing well with the study necessarily, or at least, we didn't much notice, but the FDA noticed, for example, and we ended up having to completely redo the study. And that added months and, quite frankly, millions of dollars to the project that we might have avoided if we had just spent a little bit more money up front doing our research on which CRO to go with, and maybe paying for a little bit more quality, if you will.
Right. The most expensive study is the one you have to repeat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jason, just thinking about some of the stuff that Tyler said, and for someone who might be placing their first preclinical study somewhere, considering that, is there a standard vendor qualification process, or maybe if they're building a vendor qualification process, what are the characteristics that they should be looking out for? How do you build that? And how is pricing reviewed as part of that qualification? Is there a scoring scale, or if you can elaborate a little bit there?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take this kind of in two parts, because one is, qualifying a vendor, and I can talk a little bit about that. And the other is placing work. For larger companies, they tend to have multiple vendors on the AVL, and then your approved vendor list. And then placing individual studies becomes, a kind of a secondary question. For qualifying vendors to put them on an approved vendor list, right now, given the emphasis of regulators in the preclinical world, it's all about quality, and that's both domestic regulators and international regulators. We think quality first, and very robust evaluations of quality. And I would say that's recent. We always start with a baseline of animal welfare and compliance around animal welfare. It's absolutely critical. You're dealing, at least in the U.S., generally with the USDA on the animal welfare side, and then usually the FDA on product approvals. And so those, just quality in both those areas is absolutely critical. Other things that we start looking at is how do you do pricing? What do the quotes look like? Are they transparent? Can you understand what you're getting? Full service. Do you have to consult, or do you have to yourself as a sponsor manage, contributors, whether you're bringing in physicians to do the surgery, whether you're bringing in analytical labs, how do you interact with the pathologist, which is often a key endpoint. So those things are really, on the front end, something that we're looking at. And then as we start to work with a vendor, ease of working with them. How responsive are they? How do they respond to changes that might be happening with you as a sponsor from a regulatory standpoint, and how open to those situations they are. And quality of scientific writing, which it's hard to see on the front end, but is absolutely critical on the back end, especially if you're going to submit studies, to regulators. The writing has to be really good. Now, if I switch a little bit and go, okay, now you have a handful of vendors on your approved vendor list. How do you place individual studies or groups of studies at a lab? Price is always a factor, but I would say, we start with quality always first there too. Co-location becomes really critical for a company like where I work, where we have facilities all over the country and all over the world. Travel expenses are real. The ability of teams to be on site at a CRO while the study is happening is usually pretty important, and travel costs can add up. Certainly in our current pandemic state, travel is even more, restrictive, and co-location becomes really a key. And sometimes it's co-location with the R&D team. Sometimes it's co-location with a collaborator, whether it's a physician or a key stakeholder in your product development that might not be part of your company. And then that full service experience, that end-to-end experience where you don't have to be there monitoring every single stage of the study becomes really important. That trust factor that the CRO can handle it and do the work without real close monitoring.
Great. So, speaking of travel, Tyler, any comments there? We heard the standpoint of a company like Boston Scientific, but what about a smaller company?
Yeah, I think I'd echo, especially in retrospect, having been through it, I'd echo Jason's comments that you really want to think about quality first and make sure that that's there. But then costs like travel come into play, especially for a startup. For us, in our experience, like we, this was a big ticket item for our startup company, our big preclinical studies or sets of studies, and so travel was something, definitely travel costs were something to consider, especially because we ended up deciding, after maybe cutting quarters early with an early study, that we wanted to do this study right. So we planned a full, large study with 6, actually more than that. I think we're going to do 10 collaborator surgeons to start, and then whittle that down to 8, or maybe it was 8 to 6. And so it was going to be a lot of people. And we also planned a pilot study. So we were going to have everybody do it first to make sure they understood what was going on with the animal and that they sort of knew the anatomy and whatnot. So we were doing 2 sets of studies with, half a dozen to 10 surgeons. So there was going to be a lot of travel. Ultimately, we ended up going, we did go with T3 Labs down in Atlanta area there. And one of the reasons we did that is because even though our team was traveling more, we had these, 8, 10 collaborators who we were able to source locally. And again, we chose a lab in this case because it was in a metropolitan area where we had a good access to specialists, in our case, surgical oncology specialists, who we could source to come in and do the study. And again, we were in that situation in the first place because maybe our first study, we cut some corners and we felt like we were playing, like we were playing catch up or having to really prove something to FDA. So instead of just needing maybe a couple surgeons like we would have from the get-go, now we felt like we really needed, 6 or more, to do it. So that all played into it. And ultimately having those collaborators and those specialist surgeons having to travel locally was far better, for our budget and overall than just having our team, have to travel. So we ended up, that ended up being a big consideration into our decision. Really quality first and foremost, a little bit cost, taking into account travel and everything included.
So I got a quick question. Kind of thinking about this, small company, big company, you both said quality is important. Have you all delayed any work in the face of COVID, thinking that you got to go to a particular lab for certain reasons because of the quality? Has that driven any of your decision making? And will it continue, do you think?
I can start with, I would say not delayed any, because we do have a lot of, CROs that we work with, but I would say a lot of tough decisions to be made and a lot of discussion around travel during a pandemic, where we may have to travel because of that. And then monitoring that study, both from the execution and operational side, but also monitoring from a quality side. And one of the things that we found to be very helpful is CROs that are willing to let us kind of monitor what's going on from a quality standpoint from afar. Using the digital tools that we have, not having to be on site, and looking at the documentation of the study as it's going on, and being able to, just as a sponsor, say, hey, this didn't meet the protocol. Did you write the deviation? Do you understand what's going on? Hey, we think we need to amend the protocol because this is going this way. That becomes really key. And it can save a lot of money too when you have a collaborator that's willing to let you monitor and is very transparent from a remote standpoint. So I guess to answer the question, Jeff, we haven't delayed anything, but we've certainly had a lot of discussion about it.
Yeah, I know.
I was going to say, we haven't had to delay anything from our end, just given the time, and we just didn't happen to have any studies coming up. But I'll tell you, in terms of quality, we ended up engaging a former FDA person who helped write the veterinary guidance. We worked with her as a consultant to really figure out which labs we would go for the second time around, because our first time around didn't go so well with the labs. And again, I say we sort of cut some corners, but also we just didn't have we feel like the amount of support and experience with that lab. It's sort of a newer lab that we would have wanted. And so again, the FDA found things in the writing and other things that we didn't even realize. And so we really wanted to go for that, quality. And we ultimately ended up sort of narrowing it down with this former FDA consultant who kind of narrowed it down to really the handful of labs that she felt comfortable with. And you'd be surprised, being from the FDA, she knew. She's like, this lab, that lab, these are the labs that immediately come to mind as people who do high quality work. And so we worked with her to sort of narrow it down to a handful of labs that we thought had a high enough quality for us. And we probably, again, we didn't fall in this situation with COVID, but we probably would have waited to have been able to engage with the one lab we wanted, or one of these few high quality labs, to do a study. Just because in our case, again, we went the other way and we took a chance, and it ultimately ended up costing us maybe even a year. I mean, many, many months and millions of dollars. And so, if you think about it, what's a little bit of a delay to get it right, as opposed to, you know, years and millions of dollars otherwise.
So just to digress a little bit while we're on the topic of COVID, this is more of a question for Jason and Jeff, since you guys have seen a lot of estimates during this time. Have you seen any changes in the estimates? Have there been any inflationary effects of COVID on preclinical estimates?
I would say I haven't seen it directly in estimates that appears. You know, probably more of what we've seen is over the last couple of years, because of the way the regulatory agencies have interacted in preclinical, we're seeing things change because of that. And that's mostly on the quality side. And then you've heard my emphasis on the need for quality. It's mostly been around travel, and then the ability to, are we going to send our people on an airplane and have them travel, or can we find a place where they can drive? Sure. So that cost has come into that, but I have not, you know, seen it like, you know, line itemed out or gross, you know, increases in estimates because of COVID. Okay. There were certainly capacity delays. Has probably been more of it with you know, the labs, and maybe Jeff, this is where we're going to go. You know, everybody, especially early on, was just very careful with not having people in the office, or almost coming to a point of shutdown. So capacity was a challenge. We were doing the same thing to a certain extent, so it wasn't, you know, the timing kind of coincided.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would voice the same thing. I think all businesses have experienced some degree of inflation, just in terms of the result of trying to actively manage the safety of the teams and visitors that we have on site. Added extra cleaning, more PPE, extended business hours to accommodate flexible schedules. I think have added some costs kind of behind the scenes. From a study standpoint, though, we've seen some mild cost creep with some of our supplies. PPE is an obvious one, but even some specific pharmaceuticals and some disposables have gone up. But over time, you know, when demand wanes a little bit, supply catches up, those will come back hopefully. Sure.
So Jeff, you and I have been doing this for many, many years, and we've come across many estimates and, you know, different size companies, especially for smaller companies. You know, cost is a factor, all said and done, especially when you don't have a great understanding of what's involved in a preclinical study. Is there one piece of advice that if you could give to a smaller company, you know, what type of study would you not advise choosing the least expensive CRO for?
I think in terms of types, you know, we've heard it from everybody here that the most expensive study is the one that you have to repeat. And for us, there's many reasons why we see our sponsors coming to us for these types of studies that were rejected at other labs. Some of the main ones involve around the difficulty or complexity of a study. Therefore, I'd recommend against merely using price as a metric. We've all said that when you're evaluating your bids. In complex studies involving things like cardiac bypass, heart-lung assist devices, or anything that has to do with electrophysiology, where there's lots of people and lots of equipment, and you need strong expertise and deep knowledge. In those cases, I think it's really important to focus on the expertise versus the cost. And I think another area would just be, you know, GLP. Find the right CRO for your GLP work. 21 CFR Part 58, which defines good laboratory practice. I know we keep using GLP, and for folks who haven't done GLP work, they may not know what that means, but those requirements really should be your guide in terms of how you evaluate your contract research organization. And the cheapest vendor isn't always the best, so make sure you do your homework on their track record with FDA, and most importantly, that they meet your quality standards for this type of work.
Okay, great. So Jason and Tyler, you know, when we think preclinical studies, the most obvious thing is animal work or benchtop studies, but are there any other things that a CRO contributes towards a preclinical study that may not be obvious? I mean, we've talked about animals and animal welfare and all of that, but what about things like physician recruitment? Does that play a factor? Is there a cost associated with it, or have you seen any? And I guess, my question is, outside of the preclinical, the animal component, what is the single largest expense in the planning of these studies?
Yeah, maybe I'll say a few words and then Jason, you can weigh in too. But yeah, for us, I mean, a lot of times it is the in our case, surgeon, but the collaborator component, the physician component, if you have that as part of your study, that ends up being a major expense and a major effort to coordinate too. And so for us, a big decider of where we went for this last big lab, and this was our big GLP lab, for FDA clearance that we did successfully get our FDA clearance because of. A big part of it was getting all these surgeons, in our case, to join. And so we wanted, and we were on a bit of a timeline too, because we were on the clock with FDA, and you have investors looking at you and trying to make sure that you're getting things done on time. So for us, a big draw to the lab that we chose was that they did offer services for recruiting physicians. And again, they were in a pretty large metropolitan area, in this case, Atlanta, where it was reasonable to conclude that we could get enough, in our case, 10 of these subspecialists to come in and be part of the study. And so that was something that actually helped draw us over there. And in this case, T3 was able to help us actually get a couple of surgeons for our study. We got a couple, and we were able to hit, under a pretty tight timeline, the number of surgeons or physicians that we needed to join the study. And so that was a big draw for us, because if it, we looked at one other lab we really liked, but it was a very rural lab. It would have been just fine if it was a lab with 1 or 2 surgeons and they could have had their surgeon really do part of it. We had one other person maybe, but it wasn't going to work with 10 subspecialists. And so that was a big draw for us to know that we could get it done. Because I mean, if we couldn't get them in and you missed that, well, now you miss your whole deadline, maybe your whole regulatory clearance. So things like that are helpful, and obviously they can be expensive too. So you want to think about it.
Okay.
I definitely echo what Tyler said. It's a major consideration. A couple of things I might add. One is analytical services, and in particular pathology. Don't forget about that. And depending on the type of device you have, where it's implanted, how it might be explanted, and how you might go find it again, or have a pathologist find it and stain it and read it, that if it's really easy to find and you can get a couple of slices, that cost can be pretty standardized. But we've seen at times where it's hard to find. They have to do a lot of recuts, and that cost can go up very, very quickly. And you may not expect that on the front end.
Balloon work.
What was that, Jeff?
Drug-eluting balloons.
Sure. Yes, exactly. Things that aren't implanted or aren't implanted for long. Electrophysiology technology, things like that, laser things, stuff like that, it can be very hard to find that target location. And most pathologists will tell you, oh yeah, we can find that, no problem. And then you get in there and there's 50 recuts later and they're still looking. So those costs can add up.
Yeah.
The other one that I just add, and it's maybe one that is not always thought about, but certainly in things like valves, the cost of the test article can be really, really high. And if you have a lab that doesn't have the competency that you need, you may use more test articles than you expected. Those may not be available, and they can be very, very expensive to build or rebuild.
Thanks. So, I've seen different estimates from different CROs, and I wish there was an industry standard on how estimates are built, right? You see lump sum costs, you see, just an overall cost line for a preclinical study, or there are CROs that have extremely detailed estimates with everything broken down. I guess, Jeff, you've seen all kinds of estimates. What do you think is commonly omitted that surprises the customer from these estimates?
I'd say the most commonly omitted surprises are just overages, and with the procedure room or the operating room being the most expensive, I mentioned that before. Time is money. You've got lots of people, lots of equipment, and for a number of reasons, really complex procedures can end up taking longer than you originally estimate. A lot of sponsors want to estimate for very short procedural time. It's like, everything's cookie cutter. Every animal is going to be the same. Every procedure is going to be the same. But when you've got complex procedures, you know, lots of people, lots of staff, there's just so many variables. I don't know if you'd say it's an omitted surprise necessarily, but anytime you have challenges with a particular implant or things plan, you run the risk of having postoperative complications that can also add to the cost of a study.
Okay, thanks. So, you know, speaking of surprises, Tyler and Jason, I'm sure you both have budgets for your preclinical studies. And so you have the estimate, you signed it, you're expecting a certain cost or invoice. How far off are you when you get the final invoice from CROs? Do you see a lot of variability between the initial estimate and what's finally billed to you? And how does, in terms of cost, you know, how does this compare to what you budget for clinical studies, for human studies?
I'll just say, Jason probably has a higher number of studies he could comment on for how close it's been, but I'll tell you this, of the number of studies that I've been involved with, the ones that we are less surprised on and actually have been much closer on are the ones where we spent the time upfront with the lab, going through all the costs and thinking about everything. You know what I mean? Those are the times I've been less surprised and closer to our estimate. Things like, just like you said, like surgery, you know, time in the OR, you know, rather than just slapping down a time, like really think about it and say, okay, well, how long is it going to take for that exposure? How long is it going to take for this and for that? And if you really think about it and spend the time, I think estimates end up being much closer. And the other thing is, not sure if we'd cover this otherwise, is to expect that things are going to change and can go over. So, you know, in our case, we made the decision on our second study here to budget for extra animals, at least one or a few extra animals for our study, just that we had them sitting around and ready, for our study. And of course, we were flying down our whole team from Chicago. We didn't want there to be a situation where we just, we didn't budget for enough extra animals. Then all of a sudden there was an issue with an animal and there's a surgeon who's spending half of their day with us and there's no animal because there's some problem. Well, as a little example, that's exactly what happened to us one time. We opened up this animal, we did this big exposure. This surgeon, I think from Emory, was there. And sure enough, that the animal had a major abnormality in their liver, genetic abnormality or something that caused it to be where it wasn't usable or wasn't fully usable for our study. Had we not budgeted for an extra animal in this case, we would have been short essentially on what we had promised FDA, and we would have wasted people's time and money. Fortunately, we had another one in the back. We thought about that something like this could happen, even though rare. And we had another animal ready to go, and we're able to make use of that surgeon's time and that day. And that ended up saving us a lot of time and money. And again, it didn't kill our budget because we had expected actually that we might need another animal or two. So thinking ahead, I think makes for, and spending a lot of time, planning ahead makes for a much closer budget, in terms of what you can expect and communication with your sponsor.
Yeah, I guess what I would add is look at your allowances in the quote, and because CROs put those allowances in there in very different ways. And some will try to do, let's say, a per animal cost without the allowances and then a per animal cost with, and you have to make sure you're thinking realistically around, and those allowances might be time in the OR, as Jeff said, that's probably the absolute biggest one. But that might be, every catheter you kink is now a new catheter plus a 20%, markup. Oh, we're only going to use one, and then you use 5 and you get surprised. So think about those allowances. And then I would also, the one watch out is how does the CRO handle change orders? Changes are going to happen, especially in complicated studies. And sometimes you need to have more imaging, or you need to have an extra animal, or you need to have more time in the OR. How do they handle that change order process, and how transparent is that? And then how realistic are you in reading that? You can read the minimal, this is going to be the minimal cost. I would say rarely don't expect that to be the absolute minimal cost unless you have a lot of experience with that CRO and you understand how they write their bids. It's really key. So those are two big things that I would say watch out for.
Do you this is just a general question for either of you, in your experiences maybe at your current company or other companies, do the folks who develop the estimates versus the accounts payable folks, do they talk? I often wonder if whoever signs the estimate doesn't even ever end up seeing the product sometimes.
Probably more complicated, Tyler. I'll take this. Probably more complicated at a company like where I am. Generally the teams or the money is paid out of the R&D budget as a general rule, right? They're developing the product. We have a professional preclinical group that's a corporate group, and we manage the science and the projects behind that. So it's really important that they talk, that the actual development team and then the professionals that are helping manage it talk about the realities of what things look like. That's a benefit that we have, and Tyler probably may not at a smaller company have the same type of services there, but curious how you have experienced that.
Yeah, it's funny because we are a really small, early stage university spin out company. We have at the time, I think we had maybe 6 full-time people and a couple, a lot of part-time people and consultants and whatnot, but maybe, 6 or maybe 8 full-time people. And, the batch of folks that were involved in kind of quoting out the study and planning the study were more or less the same folks that came down and did the study. And, I was the CEO, I helped, I was intricate in being involved with kind of the planning and bugging, folks about that. And then I was down there in the OR too, with it. So it was kind of our same group that saw every aspect. Other than, actually, I take that back. Our finance guy is the one guy off in the, side who's sort of, we had to keep in the loop on things. And he was, what about this? What about that? And we'd explain. But other than that, the group was pretty darn similar in terms of, the people who were sort of, doing this, planning the study, doing the study, budgeting the study, and communicating with our, finance guy on that. So, yeah.
With my CFO hat on, I would think that as companies, grow and get more complex and more sophisticated, that there'd be this feedback loop, positive and negative, from the accounting side to say, hey, you need to look at this as you're working on estimates in the future, because this is what happened in this particular set of studies.
I'll say this for sure. One thing is, again, going back to the whole, I'm glad Jason mentioned pathology. I didn't think about that, but that was huge for us. I mean, a huge expense, but also for us, the pathology and particularly like the histology that we got because of our device, and we have an electro surgical device, so there's sort of a thermal aspect that was huge. And actually the pathologist was important. And also that part of the budget was huge. It was like, for us, for this little study was tens of thousands of dollars, whereas some other study might not be so much. So it was a big thing. Communication over like where that's coming from. Is the bill coming from the main lab, or is it coming straight from the other lab who's subcontracted to do the pathology? That was important too, because if somebody just looked at one part of the study and they were missing the pathology histology aspect, and that was huge part of the study proportionally, I mean, you could be missing a big part of it. And same thing with the your collaborators, your physicians that you're having come in. Is that getting rolled up in the study, or do you got to account for that thousands and thousands of dollars somewhere else? And so obviously every company is different, but there's that idea of how are you budgeting for it, and really thinking about the the overall budget, and then tracking it to make sure that it's all going to the same place, so that people don't look, have egg on their face over the study looking way over or under or something like that, just because of budgeting or really accounting for the costs and where they.
Yeah, I had presented an estimate to a customer once, and they said to me, gosh, I could go to the ER for myself a lot cheaper than this. It's just a peg. I could buy it at a grocery store for a lot cheaper. Why is this a preclinical study so expensive? Any thoughts there? I mean, what drives the cost in the preclinical study? Why are animals so expensive? Is there, I'm guessing, or I know actually that there's a lot of regulations involved, but from the standpoint of a customer, how do you navigate through that? Are there any resources that people could learn from?
I can maybe I'll take a shot at. In a professional preclinical group in a big company, not everybody understands what we do, and we even get that question internally. And my first answer is preclinical is complicated. And what does that mean? It's very heavily regulated, for one. Multiple technologies, right? If you think about a clinical trial or something like that, it's one technology, very focused. Processes are relatively set, and not that clinical trials aren't complicated, because they're complicated too. But multiple species, doctors that can't be specialists oftentimes. Veterinarians are generalists in a lot of ways, and the staff that have to learn, one day working in endoscopy and the next day working in cardiology. It's complicated, and putting processes in place, having human imaging equipment is very expensive. And isn't used to turn and burn patients all day long. Sometimes it sits for days on end because you're in between different technologies. Those are just some of the things. It's a complicated business.
Yeah. So would you say sometimes that a preclinical study ends up being more expensive than a clinical study?
I think it can. I've seen some estimates, and I think it can.
Okay. Jeff, Tyler, any comments there?
Yeah, I would just say, I think it can. The thing about preclinical that I've noticed is it can be expensive, but it's not. It tends to not be, in my opinion, super inefficient. I mean, you're getting kind of what you're paying for. A lot of clinical studies that we've budgeted out, a lot of the cost is just going maybe to the indirects of the partner you're working with or that academic center, and there's a bit of fluff there. And sometimes it's not expensive because really it's kind of this, maybe in some cases a lot of the procedures standard of care, and you're just one piece of it. So it's not that expensive for that reason. But I've typically seen there be a lot of indirect expenses going to the institution. For the most part, with the animal studies that we've been involved in, we don't see a lot of that extra fluff, cost going into it. I think, the labs operate relatively lean, and really you're getting what you're paying for, which is, whatever your test setup is. But, maybe your animals coming in, you have this procedure. It's all about your procedure, your technology, the animals. It's pretty lean, and it is what you get, versus I've seen clinical studies, it can just be a little bit fluffy. So it can be expensive, but it's, you're definitely getting what you're paying for. So, if you think about it that way.
Yeah, I would echo. I think that if you boil it down, it is the specialization versus the generalization. Mm-hmm. Look at most professions. The Malcolm Gladwell writes, it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert, and we may have put 10,000 hours in as a team, or far more than that. But when you think about all the therapeutic areas that you have to work in the medical device space, and then all the species, I'd love to see an algorithm that calculates, how inefficient that makes us. But at the end of the day, you also really can't support a facility that only works in one species in one therapeutic area. You would go out of business pretty quick. So I think that's the main difference versus the highly specialized nature that we continue to find ourselves in any profession, but at least in the clinical realm, you're very focused, and you can get your procedure times down, and frankly, safety goes up from a patient standpoint.
Sure. Well, this has been a great discussion so far. Thank you very much. And I know there's 5 minutes left, so I want to open it up for questions. We actually have one question already. The question is, how do you measure or define quality in preclinical work? And I'll open it up to all three of you.
I'll give you one thought. So for what we did is we had engaged this, like I said, we engaged a consultant who's former FDA veterinarian. This is her life, and and she knew a lot more about some of these nuanced little things to measure quality in a lab. She knew what. I'm trying to think of some specific examples, but she knew the way that the animals are getting taken care of, and she knew that the way that the veterinarians are engaged at a study. She kind of knew and helped us understand a bunch of these individual attributes that could help predict quality. And when we were interviewing these labs, we looked at those things. So like I said, I think like maybe consider working with a consultant or something like that that can help parse out some of these specific attributes that are important for quality in your type of study. And then you can screen labs on that. You can say, do you do this when the animals come in? Is this part of your inspection, process or whatever, if it's important to you? Is it important to have a veterinarian who has experience with, your species and your type of studies, if it's an orthopedic study or whatever. So I think it kind of depends, but you can sort of decide what are the specific quality metrics that are important to you and go from there. And in general, like I think it's been said before, and I would agree with, you can, by talking to some folks, talking to folks who have been through it before, maybe talking to consultants, you can start to learn some labs that have that experience. They're known for high quality writing. That it's just hard to understand that unless you talk to folks that really can speak to that intelligently. But the quality of writing and just the format of the reports and stuff like that stuff all matters. And like I said, coming from it, not me, but an ex-FDA senior official there in FDA regarding animal studies, they know, and they can probably tell you offhand some labs that really do their homework and do a good job. And if you think about it as wanting to have your organization exude that quality and be affiliated with high quality facilities, then that matters.
Jason, any thoughts?
Yeah, Tyler hit it right on the head. It's experience, and if you don't have the experience, go buy it. It's worth its weight in gold. And then it's observation. And if you start to look and observe and watch and know what to expect, the regulations, while there's some ambiguity in them, are relatively clear, and you can go and measure if you know what you're doing. And then metrics, and it's an area that is hard to measure, but it can be measured. We're doing more and more of it. We have, the benefit at a large company of having, a very experienced, dedicated quality assurance unit that does this day in and day out. They know what to look for, and they get, very keen eye. But you can hire that too to make sure. Mm-hmm. There's, plenty of ex-FDA folks that are out there that are willing to consult with you. And to Tyler's point, they know what they're doing and they know what to look for.
Great.
I think I'll speak just on behalf of GCMI. For us, and really for any lab, it should be that quality is a journey, not a destination. It's a continuous effort, and you can self-reflect. Got a lot of experts that look at processes and the regulations, and we make sure that we're following those. But there's this thing called a Johari window number 3, where it's the part of you don't recognize. And I think for an organization, that's where our sponsor audits come in. That's where our regulated audits. So when the FDA comes in, the USDA, it's a fresh set of eyes to say, hey, we see this differently. You might want to look in this area. So kind of taking that holistic picture, as long as your organization is continually focused on quality improvement, I think that's probably the key. No matter how much experience you have, things change. Right now we're seeing changes with FDA in our world, and we're going to have to pivot, and I think it'll only prove good to improve quality across the whole industry.
Great. Well, here's one more question with 1 minute left. CROs that communicate often, transparent, and wants to partner with you are great signs in identifying the right organization. That was a comment. So thank you very much. Again, on that note, thanks everyone. I really appreciate everyone joining, and Jason, Tyler, Jeff, thanks a million for joining the session. I think we had a great discussion, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to follow up with the summit, and thank you again.
Yeah, thanks Dee. Thanks Jason, Tyler.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye.